Well, it certainly sounds like Derek Carr's visit here in New Orleans is going pretty well. We got all of that and a little bit of lagniappe for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Saints, your daily podcast covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Saints, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks so much, as always, making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. Don't forget, we're free and available on your favorite podcast app and on YouTube as well. And I'm your host, Ross Jackson, at Ross Jackson Nola on Twitter, your New Orleans Saints expert, credential member of the media, CrescentCitySports.com, USA Today Saints Wire, Tuesdays in Locked On NFL, and here with you every single Monday through Friday on Locked On Saints. Today's episode of Locked On Saints brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel. FanDuel is the America's #1 sportsbook, the official sportsbook of the NFL. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. On today's episode, more changes around the New Orleans Saints coaching staff. One hire potentially on the way, and it is an excellent one if it happens. We'll revisit this topic because I've thought about some other reasons why the New Orleans Saints are probably better off trading for Derek Carr than they are waiting for him to get to free agency. So we'll break that down. But first, the visit seems to be going well. Derek Carr and the New Orleans Saints have been together pretty much since I last sat down and recorded an episode. So Derek Carr arrived in New Orleans on Wednesday, had dinner with Saints leadership, Dennis Allen and others on Wednesday night, according to Nick Underhill over at NewOrleans.football. That visit ended, or dinner at least ended, around 10:30 p.m. But Derek Carr back in New Orleans on Thursday, visiting the Saints facility, which is par for the course. That's pretty much status quo. Anytime that you're doing a visit, you're of course going to swing over by the facility, show them, here's where your locker would be, here's what your walk from practice would be like. Oh, we have 2 practice fields, one's indoor. Do all that kind of stuff and let them know what's going on and everything. Let them see where it is that they're going to be spending the majority of their time, because even on Mondays, they're usually in there at least going through recovery and all that other stuff. So that has sort of been ongoing into the evening. I'm recording this around 6 p.m. on Thursday night. Around 5 p.m. Ian Rappaport put out a report from Radio Row, who said that the visit was still ongoing at that time. So we'll see. Maybe Derek Carr is going to, head over with DA, take a little ride over to the Superdome, run around on the field a little bit, figure out where they're going to be. But so far, so good in terms of Derek Carr. If you feel good about Derek Carr being the New Orleans Saints quarterback, and clearly the Saints do, right? Otherwise, they wouldn't be doing this. And we got a little bit of some extra insight from Tom Pelissero, I guess I'll say, over at NFL Network, where he mentioned that the Saints and the Raiders kind of had their conversations. And we talked about this yesterday. Saints and the Raiders having conversation before Derek Carr showed up for a visit. The signal of Derek Carr's visit says that the Saints and Raiders at least understand together what the asking price is, and the Saints are kind of acknowledging, yeah, we'll be somewhere in that ballpark, right? So that could mean that if the Raiders are saying, it's going to be a 3rd round pick to get him up out of Las Vegas, the Saints could say, okay, great, something the value of a 3rd round pick, like a future 4th. Well, they don't have a future 4th, but like a future 5th and a 4th round pick this year, or something like that, right? Put all the draft value charts together and then build up to a 3rd round pick, as opposed to actually giving up a top 100 selection. There's a whole bunch of things like that the Saints could potentially be looking at. But what it tells you is that they're kind of in the same ballpark and everybody's kind of in an understanding. But what Tom Pelissero gave us is that the visit was a part of the New Orleans Saints conditions on their half, saying that basically, yeah, we're in the same ballpark. We understand the interests. We each have mutual interest in potentially making this happen. But the Saints are saying, but let him come visit New Orleans first. And I think that's an interesting thing, right? Because clearly the Saints are interested. Otherwise, they wouldn't be going to this extent, right? He's got the connection with Dennis Allen. All that stuff is there. But for that to be a part of the condition, it tells you that even on the Saints side, they're kind of saying, well, let's see how this goes. Now, if they're saying, hey, we're in the ballpark, and the reported asking price for many people in their various sources is a 3rd round pick, that means that, look, that price could come up potentially, or even be a conditional 3rd round pick. based on the Raiders being willing to take on some of the contract, for instance. Or if they're not willing to take on some of the contract, then that can all come down a little bit. The other thing that could impact the real sort of compensation in this trade for the New Orleans Saints is obviously Derek Carr, right? Does Derek Carr want to be in New Orleans? So that pretty much tells you everything you need to know. It's where the Saints could say, look, he wants to be here. You're asking for a third round pick. I'll give you something in the neighborhood, but it's not going to be on the same street. I'm going to give you something from the subdivision over. Here's a fourth round pick instead. Homie wants to be in New Orleans. And then Derek Carr either forces that trade and says, yeah, that's where I'm going, much like Antonio Brown has done in the past, much like we saw with others. Deshaun Watson, obviously an outlier, got a haul absolutely for the Houston Texans for that. But for Derek Carr, if it's where he wants to be, then it's where he's going to end up one way or another. And so that could drive the asking price down as well. So this visit kind of allows the New Orleans Saints to sit down with Derek Carr, make sure that there's a fit. You have the connection with Dennis Allen. Derek Carr is a close personal friend with Demario Davis, who in an interview with Andrew Siciliano on Radio Row said that Derek Carr was a game-changing quarterback. I think there's some truth to that when you look at where he ranks amongst active quarterbacks in the NFL today when it comes to fourth quarter comebacks and game-changing quarterbacks, but he doesn't get a lot of shine in that game-changer category. But if they see him that way, then this is all going in the right direction for the New Orleans Saints. Seems unlikely that there's going to be situations where they sit down with him at dinner. He's a complete butt. I'll borrow from my 7-year-old self again. And all of a sudden the Saints say, not a culture fit, right? Seems more likely that Derek Carr would be the one to sit down and say, not a culture fit for him. But I don't know if that's going to be the case. And they took him to Ralph's on the Park. Black and catfish there is outstanding. So, it's a good meal too. All right. Coming up next, I want to remind everyone why and give you more information on why it's better for the New Orleans Saints to trade for Derek Carr than wait for him to go to free agency, even though that sounds counterintuitive. We'll get to that as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints. And today's episode of Locked On Saints brought to you by our friends over at Blue Nile. Valentine's Day is literally right around the corner, which means that romance is in the air a little bit more than usual. But I don't need to tell all you lovebirds. You already know what's going on. You've probably already got your Valentine's date set. You've got your reservations made. But do you have the perfect Valentine's Day gift yet? So whether you're celebrating the day with some romance or you might be ready to pop the question, you're going to be able to find jewelers just as unique as you and your partner with the modern convenience of online shopping over at BlueNile.com. With simple online tools, they'll allow you to choose diamond shape, size, and clarity in terms of setting style, a whole bunch of stuff you're going to be able to find. And Blue Nile's bench jewelers will handcraft the perfect piece to your specifications. They also have folks that are on ready to help you out too, provide some guidance, some in-depth educational material so that you can tell the difference between things like a princess cut and all this other stuff, right? Make sure you pick the right thing for yourself. And every order is insured, arrives quickly in discreet packaging so that it doesn't spoil the gift that's inside. Shipping is also free, and so are the returns. So right now, you can save up to 50% at BlueNile.com. That's BlueNile.com to save up to 50% today. Once again, BlueNile.com. Today's episode also brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. I just got the Kansas City Chiefs on the money line, plus 104. A little bit of a bet, had some free stuff to be able to use though, and also it's the no sweat first bet. So listen, if you're not somebody that has used FanDuel before, it's actually even better that way. See, they've got a whole bunch of great features that are going to make betting on sports super fun and easy, but also if you're a first-time user, you could download the FanDuel Sportsbook app now and bet on Super Bowl 57 with their no-sweat first bet. That means you're going to get up to $300 back in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't win, which means there's no losing, whether you're betting on the money line, point spread, who's going to score a touchdown. As long as you're putting that bet down on Super Bowl 57, you're in good shape. FanDuel Sportsbook app is safe. It is easy. It is super, super convenient and secure to use as well. And of course, you can get all your winnings back instantly. So join FanDuel today at FanDuel.com/lockedon to claim your no sweat first bet on Super Bowl 57. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sportsbook partner of the NFL. All right, family, continuing on with today's episode of Locked On Saints. Thank you, as always, for making us your first listen of the day. The New Orleans Saints would actually benefit from trading for Derek Carr as opposed to trying to wait for him to hit free agency. Why are we having this conversation? And why are we reprising this conversation? So the first reason why we're having this conversation is that February 15th is the deadline for the Las Vegas Raiders. If Derek Carr is on the roster 3 days after the Super Bowl, February 15th, then that means that his contract becomes fully guaranteed. And that's something that the Las Vegas Raiders want to avoid because Derek Carr's not going to do them any favors. He's already said that. He said that during the Pro Bowl games, basically that like, look, that's not in my best interest to, push those dates back. If you want a comparison for that, it's what David Onyemata and Marcus Davenport did for the Saints just earlier this offseason. They pushed their dates back to mid-March. Derek Carr could do the same thing, but like you said, not in his best interest. He wants to be gone. He wants out of Las Vegas. Completely get it. So why are we revisiting this topic? So sorry. We're the reason why we're asking that question is because no matter what, he's either going to get traded or he's going to become a free agent. He's not going to be on the Las Vegas Raiders roster. And so for the Saints, they could trade for him now, or they could wait for him to hit free agency and go into free agency and try to sign him up that way. The reason why we're revisiting this conversation is because there's some other things that I thought about. And here's maybe the biggest thing. There's a money game to be played here. The New Orleans Saints already know what Derek Carr's contract number is if they trade for him, which means they already have a plan for the next 3 years about how they would manage that part of their salary cap with that quarterback in the building. Restructure it the moment that he gets in the building, turn some of the money that's getting pushed down the road instead of into a signing bonus. You can turn some of it into a roster bonus. If you renegotiate the contract with them, that roster bonus could later be turned into a signing bonus and push down all the other stuff. All the usual nifty things that Kai Harley, Mickey Loomis, and New Orleans Saints like to do with contracts. If you wait for him to get to free agency, you don't know what his contract's going to look like. Yes, you have to agree on a contract with him, but the whole plan that you have right now in terms of getting that restructured and knowing exactly what you're going to do with it does become a question mark. It becomes a mystery. And you no longer dictate the terms of the contract. So that's new point number 2, right? You let Derek Carr, I almost called him David Carr. You let Derek Carr get to free agency, and then all of a sudden, 5-6 teams are wanting to sign him. The Indianapolis Colts, New Orleans Saints, the rest of the NFC South, boop, boop, boop. You've got the New York Jets. Like, there's a lot of teams that would be interested in Derek Carr's services. The guy is probably a top 15, top 16 quarterback, at least on a good day, if not on a bad day, considering all the bad quarterbacks across the NFL. So for New Orleans, they would then enter a situation where they're in a bidding war and no longer control the contract conversation. Because yes, you would negotiate the contract with Derek Carr, but what if the Jets are offering more money? You got to come up. What if the Panthers are offering more money? You got to come up. You have to then get into sort of this competition to where you're not negotiating with Derek Carr anymore. You're negotiating with Derek Carr, the New York Jets, the Carolina Panthers, the Atlanta Falcons, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, the Indianapolis Colts, so on and so forth. That's not an ideal situation, right? I think we can all agree on that. So right now, if you were to trade for him, yes, you have to give up draft capital, but not a ton of draft capital. Like I mentioned, you could give up a 3rd-round pick because that's what all the reports are saying, or you couldn't. You can give up a future 3rd-round pick and a present 4th-round pick if you wanted to, and that value all kind of comes together. So there's a bunch of different ways that the Saints can give up a 3rd-round pick in terms of value without actually giving up a 3rd-round pick. So it's not the end of the world. And let's be honest, if they do give up a 3rd-round pick, who cares? Because you're getting a starting quarterback. You know what you're not going to get with a 3rd-round pick? A starting quarterback. So with that, all of this to me makes sense to trade for Derek Carr if that's the quarterback that the New Orleans Saints want. Don't jump into the bloody waters of free agent negotiation, contract negotiation, all of that. The last piece is one that we've already kind of touched on here, but also we mentioned before, and it's that competition, right? You're going to have way less competition in the trade market than you're going to have in free agency. We just laid out there would be like 5 or 6 teams in addition to the New Orleans Saints in free agency. Right now, the New Orleans Saints look like they're in the absolute driver's seat right now when it comes to Derek Carr. Now, we've seen this before. They were in the driver's seat with Ndamukong Suh. They were in the driver's seat with Marquez Valdes-Scantling. They were in the driver's seat with Deshaun Watson. Now they're in the driver's seat, according to some, when it comes to Derek Carr, or at least the front runner when it comes to Derek Carr. So nothing is guaranteed. But if you get him to say, yeah, I want to go to New Orleans, and you get the Las Vegas Raiders to trade him, then it is guaranteed. If he goes to free agency, nothing is guaranteed until somebody like Derek Carr puts pen to paper in your facility. And that's where things can get a little bit dicey. That's where things can get a little bit tricky. So you would want to keep yourself sort of in the bright blue waters as opposed to in the bloody red waters of free agency. So I just wanted to kind of reprise that conversation once more, because I'm still kind of getting that question, like, why wouldn't you just wait for Derek Carr to hit free agency as opposed to trading for him? And I think like those are three really solid reasons. You control the contract. Not only do you control the contract, but first and foremost, you know what the contract is, so you know what you need to do with it in the future. You control the contract negotiations without other teams sticking their dirty noses into the negotiations. And then you have less competition when it comes to the trade market versus the free agency market. And again, I'll even add a fourth point just to recap it. You're giving up a potential 3rd round pick for a starting quarterback. That's better than what you're going to get with a 3rd round pick in a quarterback. Once again, one of the 75 quarterbacks taken over the last 10 years after round 2 of the NFL draft has been a starting quarterback in the NFL for an extended period of time, Dak Prescott. That's it. So if you're not drafting a top 2 talent, causation, correlation, right? Doesn't matter if you just draft him in the first 2 rounds, but if you draft somebody with the talent to be taken in the first 2 rounds, you're in a much better position. 50%, 15 out of the last 30 drafted in the first round over the last 10 years, 4 out of the last 8 drafted in the second round over the last 10 years. You're in a much better position there. So you could bypass all of that by drafting a guy that's already a starting quarterback in the NFL, and it's already an upgrade in terms of what you expect to have available on your team in 2023. All right. Coming up next, the New Orleans Saints might be about to make a big position coach hire that can change the game for guys that you love, like Juwan Johnson and Taysom Hill. We got that coming up for you as we continue on to wrap up today's episode of Locked On Saints. And today's episode of Locked On Saints is brought to you by our friends over at TurboTax. It's tax season, y'all. So head over to TurboTax today and don't do your taxes. Instead, meet with an expert while they do them for you. TurboTax experts can relieve you from all of the stress of tax season and can file for you so that you can do not taxes. You can show your eyes things that aren't taxes. You can listen to music that isn't taxes. You can boil yourself a fresh pot of not taxes. You can do all the things that you have to do that have nothing to do with taxes. You can ride not taxes off into the sunset. With TurboTax, an expert will do your taxes for you from start to finish, ensuring that your taxes are done right, guaranteed. So that way you can relax. Feels good to be done with your taxes, doesn't it? Head over to TurboTax today and don't do your taxes. Visit TurboTax.com to learn more. Intuit TurboTax, full service products only. Video meeting with an expert who does your taxes is required. See guarantee details over at TurboTax.com/guarantees. Let's get it, Who Dat Nation. Wrap it up today's episode of Locked On Saints with some New Orleans Saints coaching staff updates. A report came out yesterday, or on Wednesday. Let me be more accurate for you there. Report came out on Wednesday that the New Orleans Saints were nearing a deal with tight end coach Clancy Barone. And I have to tell you, the Saints will make another excellent position coach hire if they do indeed hire Clancy Barone. The other position coach hire that was excellent, Marcus Robertson. Huge hire in the secondary. Now they're looking at the tight end spot, which was the only offensive coaching staff presently. Let me say it that way. The only coaching staff spot on the offensive side that has presently been vacated. We'll break down some of the guys that have been getting some offers and some conversation elsewhere. It might not be the only one for the entire offseason, but it is the only one that's open right now. After the New Orleans Saints moved on from Dan Rochar, who was their tight end coach as well as passing game coordinator, who is now taking a job over at Tulane. So he's staying in New Orleans with the offensive line. So here's a couple of reasons why Clancy Barone would be a super dope hire for the New Orleans Saints. First of all, got a ton of experience with various teams coaching both offensive line and tight ends. Those positions kind of swap up a little bit. You see people bouncing between those positions quite a bit. He's been doing that since 2004. During his time as a position coach, he has worked with Pro Bowl tight ends like Algie Crumpler, Antonio Gates, Julius Thomas, and Kyle Rudolph. He is one of the only, if not actually the only tight end coach in NFL history to have 4 tight ends on 4 different teams make the Pro Bowl. And the thing that's crazy is that they all made the Pro Bowl in his first year as their tight ends coach. So he clearly is a bit of a difference maker. Yes, he has overlap with Dennis Allen. I know you're wondering. He was actually a coach at Texas A&M while Dennis Allen was a player. So while he was attending Texas A&M, they also overlapped in 2011, where Dennis Allen was on the defensive side and Barone was over on the offensive side. And he also overlapped with Joe Woods, New Orleans Saints recently hired defensive coordinator in Denver in 2015, 2016. That's when he worked with Julius Thomas. Now, one other highlight, or two other highlights technically, but one other thing for you. Algie Crumpler and Antonio Gates led their teams in receptions in his first year as tight end coach as well. So he has done some really, really solid things with tight ends in the past. He's also worked with a couple of younger tight ends. Cole Kmet, for instance, didn't have the same type of success with Cole Kmet as he had with, Algie Crumpler and Antonio Gates and Julius Thomas and all these other guys. And Kyle Rudolph. But he's had some good success still recently working with Kyle Rudolph not too long ago. So he would have a huge impact, it seems, on Juwan Johnson, and maybe could be the draw to keep Juwan Johnson in New Orleans. Now, the New Orleans Saints want to have a hard time keeping Juwan around. He's a restricted free agent, and that's because he came in as an undrafted free agent in the NFL, but he has had enough experience to move into restricted free agent territory, which simply means that the Saints have three options with him in terms of ways to keep him. First of all, they could do a lower level contract, which is called, what they would do with all of these are called a tender, TENDR. They're not sending Juwan Johnson out on a booty call. So the lowest tier of a tender in restricted free agency is called a right of first refusal tender. So it's cheaper. If a team makes him an offer, the Saints either match it or don't match it. That's the right of first refusal. If they don't match it, then Juwan Johnson just signs with that other team. For a little bit higher of a price, they could do what's called a second round tender. Same thing, they offer that tender to him. If a team comes to him and sends him an offer sheet for a contract, the Saints can choose to match that contract like they did in the past with Josh Hill. Ironically enough, it was the Cleveland Browns that were trying to sign him away, the Chicago Bears, who we were just talking about, who tried to sign him away. And if the Saints don't match that contract, then they get a second round draft pick in return. There's also a first round tender, which is the highest one. The last time that the Saints used that was for Taysom Hill here recently. Same principle, but if they don't match the offer sheet and Juwan Johnson signs elsewhere, then the Saints get a first round pick in return. So the Saints have a lot of control here in terms of what needs to happen in order to keep Juwan Johnson in the building. And now you see the benefit that a guy like Clancy Barone, not to be confused with Doug Marrone, would bring to that tight end position. And maybe that makes things a little bit easier for Juwan Johnson, makes Taysom Hill a little bit more invigorated and excited as he continues to develop as a tight end, especially if the Saints are going out and getting Derek Carr, which, how does Taysom Hill fit into that picture? Now, Taysom Hill could also be on his way to Denver for all we know, too. We'll see how all of that pans out. So, good stuff for the New Orleans Saints. If they can get Clancy Barone, again, they're working towards a deal. No deal is official at this time. If a deal does get done, and really even now, it does signal that Declan Doyle, who was New Orleans Saints offensive assistant, was offered a tight ends coach job with the Denver Broncos and Sean Payton. It does signal that maybe Doyle is on his way to Denver. That's not a huge loss for the New Orleans Saints. They can find other offensive assistants, but you really like Declan Doyle. He was a good dude and did some good work with that coaching staff. Good news for the Saints is that they might have that next person there. Assistant to the head coach, Kevin Petrie, is returning to New Orleans, and perhaps the Saints will look to elevate him to Declan Doyle's post as offensive assistant. So that could work really, really well for Kevin Petrie, give him a little bit of other more responsibility, keep him in New Orleans. The other coach that has gotten a look elsewhere here recently over on the offensive staff side is Ronald Curry. And we knew this was going to be the case. We talked about this last week, I think it was, that after they hired away Zach Strief, who else could follow? Ronald Curry was a shoo-in. Quarterback coach, passing game coordinator for the New Orleans Saints, getting some conversation with Sean Payton as the offensive coordinator in Denver. Here's the thing that might keep Ronald Curry in New Orleans. Realistically, how much longer is Pete Carmichael your offensive coordinator, right? If Ronald Curry is looking at his future projections here, does he want to be with a team where he could potentially be the play caller next year? Or does he want to go to a team where he's going to consistently be a non-play caller as long as he sticks around there? One way or another, you're waiting for a play calling opportunity, doing it in the place where you know as long as even the head coach is around, you still get to do it, versus doing it in a place where you know as long as the head coach is around, who a franchise just traded for, signed to a 5-year extension, all these other things, or a multi-year extension, that you're never going to get those play calling opportunities. So for Ronald Curry, if he wants to be a play caller, New Orleans could be the option there in terms of keeping him around, unless he gets an opportunity elsewhere. Here again, remember, he's also interviewed with the Bucs earlier this offseason as well. So if that happens, though, let's just entertain the idea here with the little bit of time that we have left that Ronald Curry gets hired away to Denver. New Orleans has two options at quarterback coach. Okay. And just kind of putting all the dots together, right? In terms of who's got some overlap with Dennis Allen, all these other things. I would hate to do this. I would hate to do this to the New Orleans Breakers, but I could see DA calling John DeFilippo and bringing him back to the NFL. He is right now the head coach, set to be the head coach for the USFL New Orleans Breakers. Who knows? He might also even be able to do that. I don't know. I don't know how that all works. I can't imagine because there's so much offseason stuff that has to happen. But if it has to happen, sorry, New Orleans Breakers, it can. He was with Dennis Allen in Oakland from 2012 to 2014, worked with Derek Carr in 2014 as a part of that. So if Derek Carr is the New Orleans Saints' next quarterback, John DeFilippo could get that phone call. Clearly, totally fine, at least with New Orleans sports. The other one, Joe Lombardi. I know he wasn't a very good offensive coordinator in either of his stops, whether it be Detroit years ago or Los Angeles here recently, but he was an excellent quarterback coach. Again, continuity. Dennis Allen knows him. Oh, and by the way, speaking of open jobs, I mentioned Zach Strief earlier, who was hired away to Denver to be their offensive line coach. That opened up a position here in New Orleans for assistant offensive line coach, working with Doug Marrone. If the Saints were to maintain the assistant offensive line coach position, which they may not, they don't necessarily have to. They have a veteran offensive line coach. But if they wanted to have an assistant offensive line coach, Jari Evans should be the guy. I'm throwing Jari's hat in the ring. The work that he did with Cesar Ruiz last year was absolutely phenomenal. It was world class. And that's not to say that Cesar Ruiz was like lost without Jari Evans or anything like that. Cesar Ruiz was taking steps forward with or without. But Jari's work with him, whole other level. So there's my vote for assistant offensive line coach, since I know you're all clamoring to know who's going to be the Saints' next assistant offensive line coach. All right. It's my birthday on Saturday, so I probably won't be around over the course of the weekend doing anything extra, unless, of course, Derek Carr becomes a New Orleans Saint. Then no matter what, I'll be here. If you see me out at the parades, say what's up. And I really appreciate y'all. Seriously, this has been a very fun week. We've had some of the biggest shows we've ever had on the podcast ever over the course of this week. So seriously, like, thank you for making this show what it is and helping me like love my job every single day. I appreciate y'all. In fact, I love you. All right. So I will see y'all on Monday. Unless there's big Derek Carr news, mock draft Monday, we'll have a ton of fun with it. And keep you up to date with everything, of course, also going on around Derek Carr and all else with the New Orleans Saints. Appreciate you as always making me your first listen of the day every day. Don't forget to go and check out Locked On NFL. Get all the news you need to know from Radio Row, as well as all of our Super Bowl predictions in Game to Game coming up on Friday as well. So I appreciate y'all as always making us a part of your day, part of your routine, for saying yes to me and the show. As always, if you see me, say hi. And if you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on Twitter, Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know how the family's doing. Let me know how you living. Let me know how you momming them. And trust Who Dat Nation, I'll holla at you.